Ever wonder how therapists, deal with their own baggage while they're helping others? It's a question that kind of makes you think, right? And today, we're really going to unpack this idea of a therapist's unresolved trauma and how it can especially impact clients who are dealing with CPTSD. And just in case, CPTSD or complex post traumatic stress disorder usually comes from long term or recurring trauma, and it can lead to, well, a lot of challenges: difficulty managing emotions, a really negative self image, and problems in relationships, just to name a few. So, this deep dive is actually inspired by an idea we had for an episode about this therapist, Laura. She seems successful, but she started noticing how her own past experiences were kind of showing up in her work with clients. And there was this one client in particular, Anna. Laura, from what we gathered, had been a therapist for like a decade, and she really believed in the power of therapy, which actually adds another layer to this whole thing. She was drawn to this work because of her own experiences growing up with a narcissistic mother and a father who was, well, emotionally MIA. And it's interesting, right? Because we all have our own histories, and it's not unusual for therapists to be drawn to this field because of their own experiences. But what's really fascinating about Laura's story is how her personal history started to intersect with her work, especially with Anna, who was, trying to come to terms with growing up with a narcissistic mother herself. Can you imagine constantly feeling invisible and unworthy like Anna did? That's a lot to carry. Now, picture this. You finally decide to get help, you open up in therapy, and then your therapist basically pushes you towards forgiveness before you're even remotely ready for it. And that's exactly what happened to Anna. When she expressed, totally valid anger towards her mother, even thinking about going no contact to protect herself, Laura's reaction was, well, kind of intense. She brushed off how strongly Anna was feeling and even told this whole anecdote about being ghosted by a friend, as if those two things were even comparable.
It gets it gets a bit more complicated. Laura actually went as far as telling Anna that going no contact would crush her mother and that she needed to put her mother's feelings first. She even used that phrase, blood is thicker than water, which, come on, completely disregards everything Anna had been through and how she was feeling. It was almost like Laura was trying to rewrite her own past through Anna's therapy, which is, yeah. And so, not surprisingly, when Anna tried to talk to her mom with Laura's encouragement, she ran into that same wall of invalidation and emotional manipulation.
And ultimately, Anna ended up leaving therapy feeling even more hurt and misunderstood, like her experiences hadn't really been heard or validated. But here's where the producer's note gets really interesting. Laura actually started to realize she was projecting her own unresolved stuff onto Anna, like she was trying to guide Anna down this path of forgiveness that she herself hadn't actually fully walked. It seems like Laura was so focused on helping others heal that she kind of accidentally neglected her own healing process. And this brings up a really big question. What happens when therapists don't deal with their own baggage? How does that impact their clients, especially those like Anna who are dealing with the complexities of CPTSD? To dig into these questions, we're joined by our expert who has a deep understanding of both complex PTSD and, how a therapist's personal history can influence their work. This whole thing with Laura makes you wonder, how often does this happen? Where a therapist is kind of drawn to clients who remind them of their own past?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Laura's story just shows how much our personal histories can, sneak into our work.
Yeah.
Even when we're trying to be objective, it's like there's this undercurrent that can either be, helpful or can totally throw you off.
And this note mentions insecure attachment when talking about Laura. Is that kind of what you mean by this undercurrent?
It's definitely a part of it. Our early relationships, especially the ones with our parents or caregivers, those really shape how we see all relationships.
Okay.
Those early experiences create these, blueprints. We call them attachment styles.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up influencing how we connect with people our whole lives.
So, someone who had a good childhood, lots of love and stability, would have a different blueprint than someone who, say, dealt with neglect or inconsistency from their parents growing up.
Exactly. When those early relationships are solid, when they're healthy, we usually develop what we call a secure attachment style.
Makes sense.
But when those early relationships are, well, kind of messed up, neglect, inconsistency, even trauma, that's when we see insecure attachment styles develop.
Which sounds like what might be going on with Laura, given her history with her own parents.
It's definitely possible. And this is a big one for therapists to really get. If they haven't dealt with their own insecure attachment patterns, it can create blind spots in how they work with clients.
Blind spots? How so? What would that look like in an actual therapy session?
Okay, so think back to Laura's reaction to Anna's anger and how much she pushed forgiveness. That could be a sign of what we call overcompensation.
Power compensation.
Yeah. It's like the therapist is, maybe without realizing it, trying to fix something from their own past, but through their client.
Wow. So it's not just knowing the theory about attachment, but like really looking at how your own attachment style could be showing up in the therapy room. And you might not even know what's happening.
You got it. And listen, it's not about pointing fingers at therapists
Mm.
or saying they shouldn't have gone through tough stuff. It's about self-awareness. That's key.
So important. So then, if a therapist hasn't really dealt with those potential blind spots, what are the risks for the client sitting across from them?
There are a few. One is what we've been talking about, those blind spots,
Hmm.
where a therapist might totally miss what a client's going through or misunderstand it because it's poking at their own unresolved stuff.
Oh, I see.
Like, imagine a therapist who grew up being told to just get over things, to suppress their emotions. They might have a hard time with a client who needs to, really express those feelings.
That's a good point.
And that actually leads to another risk emotional avoidance.
What's that?
This is when a therapist, again, maybe not consciously, starts avoiding any topic that feels too close to home for them, even if the outputs are super important for the client to heal.
So instead of the client's needs guiding the therapy, it's the therapist's own discomfort calling the shots.
Yeah, and it's not always deliberate. Sometimes it's just a little shift in the conversation, steering away from something that feels too triggering for the therapist to handle.
And that's a bit concerning, right? Because if a therapist isn't aware of this pattern, their own unresolved stuff can really start to seep into the therapy in some not so great ways.
Exactly, and that's where countertransference comes in.
Right. We touched on countertransference earlier. Can you unpack that a bit more? Like, what does that actually look like? And why is it so important for both therapists and clients to get this?
Sure, countertransference is kind of complex, but it's basically when a therapist's own feelings, experiences, all their unresolved baggage gets triggered by the client.
Hmm.
It's almost like a flip-flop of transference where the client's the one projecting.
So instead of the client saying, "You remind me of my dad," it's the therapist unconsciously reacting to the client as if they were their dad.
You got it. And it can be subtle, like finishing a client's sentences with your own assumptions, or really obvious, like always bringing the conversation back to your own issues.
Wow. So countertransference can really throw a wrench in the whole therapy process if it isn't dealt with.
You're absolutely right. But here's the thing. It's not that countertransference is always bad or weird or anything. It's actually pretty normal. It's part of the process. It's how therapists handle it that makes all the difference.
So how can therapists avoid letting their past, mess with their client's progress? What can they do to be their best in the therapy room? So how can therapists avoid letting their past, mess with their client's progress? What can they do to be their best in the therapy room?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It
Yeah.
really comes down to self-awareness and being willing to, keep learning and reflecting on their work.
So it's not enough to just get that therapist license and then coast. Therapists kind of have to keep doing their own work too.
Totally. And a big part of that is supervision.
Oh, right.
Finding a good supervisor, someone experienced
Yeah.
to talk through cases with, that can be huge. It gives therapists a safe space to process those tough cases, figure out what their reactions to clients might be telling them, and really try to spot those blind spots we were talking about.
It's kind of like having a mentor or a coach to help you stay on track.
Exactly. Think of it like a mirror. A good supervisor can reflect back, not just the good stuff, but the stuff that therapists might not want to see, the stuff that might be getting in the way.
This is making me think about the whole therapy thing in a totally different way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot more, complex than it seems,
It really is. Therapy, it's a very human thing. Both people in that room, the therapist and the client, they bring their whole selves. And that's not a bad thing at all. It's something to be curious about and open to. It's about growing.
So where does this leave everyone listening, especially if they're thinking about starting therapy or are already in therapy?
Here's the thing. Therapy can be amazing. It can really help people heal and change. But it's about finding the right fit. The therapist needs to have the skills, sure, but also the self-awareness to really navigate the relationship. Because that's what it is, a relationship.
Right, like any relationship, you're looking for trust, for someone who's real with you and who's going to create a safe space for you to heal and grow.
Exactly. And just like you wouldn't hesitate to ask a doctor about their background, it's totally okay to ask a therapist about how they handle things like countertransference or even how they take care of themselves.
You're really saying it's about being a smart consumer. Like therapists, they're people too. They have their own stories. And those stories are going to affect the work.
100%. And if a therapist gets defensive or blows off those questions, that might be a sign to look somewhere else.
Wow, this has really been eye-opening. It's a good reminder that therapy isn't one size fits all. It's a journey, and both people in that room are on it together. We've really dug deep into this whole idea of what happens when therapists haven't dealt with their own stuff and how that can impact the work they do. If this has got you thinking, we want to hear from you. Write to us at podcast email address because your voice matters in this conversation.